The HID lighting that we use in our gardens creates a tremendous amount of heat, and this is often one of the greatest challenges that gardeners face, is controlling their environment in a way that supports maximum yield. So there are certain environmental parameters that we have to adhere to in order to support maximum yield. For example, temperature, lights on temperature between 80 to 85, lights off temperature 70 degrees Fahrenheit, no lower. We need a 10 to 15 degree differential between lights on and lights off. We want to maintain a humidity of 50 to 60%, and we need good air movement. So how do we achieve these things? There are many different ways of handling the heat. One of the most basic ways to approach this in a garden is to simply move air. We have intake and exhaust. So it is typical that we move about 150 cubic feet per minute for every 1,000 watts of lighting in the garden. And then on intake, we could have, say, 100 CFM. We like to maintain a negative pressure. That means that we have more air leaving the garden than we have coming in, because we often have odor to control. So we use what we call carbon filters to control that odor. The carbon absorbs what we call VOCs, volatile organic compounds, which are odor molecules, and that way coming out of the exhaust is just clean, fresh air. So it is definitely important, if you choose to go this route in handling your heat, to get the proper size exhaust fan for your garden and the proper size intake. This is something that can be learned through experience. There are definitely ways of measuring heat. We measure heat in what we call BTU, the British Thermal Unit. And it is true that 1,000 watt of lighting creates 3,300 BTU heat units. And if we're going to approach, say, a more technical method of cooling our garden, like air conditioning, then we can correlate these numbers. Air conditioners are rated in tons, which correlate to BTU. For example, we might use a 3 or 4 ton air con on 8 or 10,000 watts of lighting. There are some ins and outs that go with any of these choices. However, there are a lot of options that will allow you to cool your garden. For example, there's even reflectors that are air cooled. You can draw air through there, removing the majority of the heat produced by the lighting, and cool the garden that way. So we're typically looking at how do we keep the garden an acceptable temperature during the lights on period that is normally done with exhaust and intake or air conditioners. Now keep in mind, we are trying to provide the plants with an environment that supports maximum yield. Now, what goes into photosynthesis, right? We have what we call the triangle of photosynthesis. Light energy in the presence of CO2 and water and nutrient is processed into sugars and starches. This is lights on metabolism. So if you do not have enough CO2 in your garden, that lighting that you're paying all that money to generate will literally bounce off the leaves. If we don't have enough water and nutrient to support the process of photosynthesis, the triangle also breaks down. So whenever we're assessing situations in a garden, we have to keep the triangle of photosynthesis in mind. So where do we get our CO2 from? We get it from the outside air, or we enrich the garden artificially. So basically, you have to understand that when you're gardening in an indoor environment, you are either going to move a lot of air, or you're going to seal it up and enrich with CO2. We don't normally enrich gardens where there is massive intake and exhaust. It gets pretty hard to make efficient use of the CO2 in those circumstances. And one of the things I say to a lot of beginner gardeners is you don't need to start with CO2 right off the bat. If you set up your garden with an adequate intake and exhaust system and get some experience, get the bugs worked out, then you can bring in additional cooling when you have more money to invest and enrich with CO2 at that point. There is also an alternate system of cooling where we use what we call a chiller or a swamp cooler. It's basically a large fan unit with a radiator inside of it, and we pass cold water through the rad, drain to waste, and the chiller in the garden draws the hot, wet air through the cold rad, removing the heat and excess moisture. So another option, but in any case, we need to maintain the environmental parameters to support maximum yield. 80 to 85 lights on, 70 lights off. So during the lights off period, especially winter months, it becomes necessary to heat our gardens. We control all of these appliances with automated thermostats. I know that sounds complicated, but really, you get a cooling thermostat for your cooling equipment, you get heating thermostats for your heating equipment. These items will provide you with a stable environment. One of my maxims is that plants love consistency. So you really have to automate everything in the garden. And then you need to monitor what's happening in the garden. One of the most important tools for doing this is what we call a min-max. It's a very inexpensive temperature and humidity monitoring device, often with an additional probe that you can actually place right in among your plants. So as one of your routines during the day, you come into your garden, you check your min-max to make sure that your cooling equipment is working properly and your heating equipment is working properly. That way, you're not going to wonder why in a week your plants aren't growing because it's getting too cold while the lights are off and they're not drinking water and you're shutting down their metabolism. You're not going to be that guy because you're checking and you know exactly what's happening in that environment, and then you can identify a problem. So what I'm trying to explain to you is the principles so that you can use your own intelligence to assess what are the best choices for your garden and assess potential problems and how to address them. If you understand the environment that you need to create, then you can research and understand the different methods available to you to create that environment. Also, air movement is very important in gardens. Not only does it control fungal infections and pests, but air movement is also like exercise for our plants. So as the same way our muscles tear and repair, plants need a little bit of movement so that their branches crack and repair, get stronger, and then can hold large, fully developed blooms. So these are the basics of putting together an environment. Talk to your local hydroponic retail professional, and they should be able to guide you through the details of this endeavor. Stay tuned for the next segment.